All right, so as promised, part two of our Louisiana series. I'll quickly do a summary of what we talked about in part one. I'll talk quickly about what I plan to talk about in part three, and then we'll get into part two. We're going to talk about the northwest corridor of Louisiana, and I'll cheat and we'll talk a little bit about southern Arkansas as well. Um, so I think this will be an interesting one to go over. Reminder: if you have any questions, email me. I'll try to remember to leave my email in the body of the article of this Substack post. As always, I will do a summary article at the end of this Substack post. If you don't want to watch the whole video, feel free to read the article. You should be able to glean most of what I say off of that. Next item of business, really quick. We had a lot of people sign up for the Substack this past week. Thank you. We appreciate you watching us and appreciate you taking interest in Plainview. If you want to help beta test this platform that I'll be showing you the flows on today, please reach out. I think a lot of you guys would be good candidates to do that. It's free. We're looking for beta testers. Tell us what you like. Tell us what you don't like. Tell us what you'd like to see ideally. That's how kind of we're making new stuff on the platform and adding new data. So without further ado, let's get into part two of Louisiana, and I will go over quickly what we talked about first. So I'm going to turn on the refineries. So these gray dots are the refineries. Part one, we talked about this southwest corner of Louisiana and the three refineries here. So really, my kind of thesis behind this is you should think about Louisiana as kind of three different refinery markets. So you should think about it as this southwest corner, this northwest corner, and then this, let's call it the southeast corner. These are kind of separate markets. They interact with each other a little bit, but not really a ton. So I think about them separately, and you can think about them holistically as well. But I think thinking about them separately helps understand what's happening with the flows and the supply and demand in this state. So, in part one, we talked about how Citgo was expanding their pipeline into their own refinery here. And that would potentially create some displacement of volumes that were coming across on Bayou Bridge and Zydeco. I would note we haven't seen that yet. The only thing that's happened with Citgo pushing more of Citgo expanding their pipeline and moving more volumes this way is they've run the refinery at higher utilization. So we haven't yet seen any downside for Bayou Bridge and Zydeco from that Citgo expansion. But you should think about this piece here as being largely fed by these lines coming across from Texas. There is an exception. This Calcasieu refinery, the third refinery, the smaller refinery here, is getting waterborne barrels in mostly. So that's one that's a bit of an exception. It doesn't appear to me that they're taking substantial barrels off of the pipelines or any barrels off of the pipelines. That are coming across there. So that's an interesting piece and dynamic to think about. In part three, we will talk about this piece, the southeast part of Louisiana, and really the most important piece of that is the offshore here and the production that comes from the offshore. So we'll certainly talk about that. And then the kind of the flex or the marginal supply is coming from here with Bayou Bridge and Zydeco coming across. It's also coming down from Capline here. And then it's coming across from Permian Express. So we'll talk about that in part three. And let me clear this out, and we'll talk about these this time. So what we're going to talk about with these are the five refineries here. Three of them are very small and aren't really that important to the story for the flows and the supply and demand for this. So let's just jump in and really quick, I'll just show you on a spreadsheet since we won't go one by one. I think it's probably easier to do this on a spreadsheet. Is to show the throughputs, the capacities, and the utilization for these refineries. So we'll talk really quickly about these three little ones, and I'll show you guys where they are on the map. They don't run at full utilization typically. They're appear to me to be sourced mostly by truck, and that's going to be local production coming in on the trucks. So just showing that on the map here. Let me just turn this on. So let's look at the refineries first. So here's the Smackover refinery here in southern Arkansas. Here's the Cotton Valley Calumet refinery, and here's the Princeton refinery for Calumet. So to orient you a little bit, the production, there is local production in southern Arkansas. The state as a whole produces about 11,000 barrels a day of production. I think probably most of that, almost all that, is in the southern portion of the state here. So all these pipelines, it appears to me, take some local production via trucks. The small refineries are taking probably the lion's share of that, as I don't see them. I don't see any evidence via the data that I look at that any of the small refineries are taking anything materially off the pipelines that are coming in and feeding this area. So these other two refineries in northwest Louisiana, the other two small ones, they are probably taking some local production. Local production here is about 10,000 barrels a day, and there's probably some local production that sneaks across the border from East Texas. That's probably, depending on where you want to draw your circular box, 20 to 25,000 barrels a day. Some of that's going to go south, some of that's going to go on the pipelines, but some of it certainly goes by trucks, and I think feeds some of these refineries here. So we won't talk too much about those, but what is worth talking about are the two bigger refineries, I think. They're an important part of the story of this corridor and kind of the dynamic between the two big players, the two big pipeline players. And really it's Plains that kind of dominates this area, with Energy Transfer having a little bit of an impact as well. So let's focus on the Calumet refinery first here. It's 57,000 barrels a day. And let's go back to our spreadsheet really quick. So on their website, or on their financials, they actually quoted 60,000 barrels a day. The EIA number is 57,000. So pick whichever one you'd like. What's interesting about this refinery is I went back in their financials. I went back in the state data. They don't run this refinery at full utilization. They haven't for the past decade. So to the extent that they ever decide to kick up the utilization of this refinery, there could be some upside for some of the pipelines that feed in here. And we'll talk about those pipelines. But it's interesting that they've run this thing pretty steady at 2/3, 65 to 70% utilization for the past decade plus. So let's talk about where this pipeline, and I think it's probably best if we kind of work our way backwards. Maybe that's not the best, but let's try to work our way backwards from the refinery, and then work our way back to where they're getting their supply from, for both this refinery, and then we'll talk about Delek's El Dorado refinery, the biggest refinery here. So again, let's start with Calumet. So let's look. What's interesting about Calumet is they don't own a lot of pipelines, but they do own kind of a last mile pipeline into this facility that feeds their facility here. So if we look at the flows on this one, you see about 35 to 40,000 barrels a day. Remember, the throughput is about 40,000 barrels a day. So anything that's not, most of the supply that's coming into this refinery is coming from this pipeline, with a little bit probably supplemented from local production on trucks. Now, what is actually, where is this pipeline getting its volumes or its supply from? So if we click on the receipt transaction point here, and we click on transactions, it appears that almost everything is coming from Plains' Caddo pipeline in orange. And I'll just take off the net here. And you can see, if you squint a little bit, what's interesting is Permian Express has actually started to deliver into this pipeline and refinery as well. The last few months. So that's interesting. Definitely something to keep an eye on. Potentially some competition here, but it does appear that Caddo kind of dominates the supply market for this refinery. If we pull up Caddo pipeline, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about Delek's El Dorado refinery. So this is a pipeline that's moving crude oil volumes from the Longview area over into this Shreveport area. So they're dumping into this, I think it's the Brown terminal here, where Calumet takes it. They're also dumping volumes into Delek's Magnolia pipeline that'll take those volumes north. And we'll get to that pipeline here shortly. But if you look at the flows on this pipeline, let me zoom in so we get the flow point. let's call it 70,000 barrels a day flowing on this pipeline. So those barrels are being split between what's going into Calumet and, spoiler alert, what's going into Magnolia. So again, Calumet, they don't have, I looked at their financials, they don't have commitments on pipelines except for a 5,000 barrel a day commitment on a pipeline that was supposedly built in 2020. I don't know what pipeline that would be. I don't think it's related to this area at all. It's probably somewhere else. I would guess Permian. But Calumet does have refineries in other areas, so it's probably not tied to this area, would be my guess. But yeah, a good overview of Calumet. I guess one more thing I would mention is to build off of the fact that they don't have pipeline commitments. It appears, looking at Caddo's financials, that there aren't very many uncommitted shippers shipping on this. So Caddo Pipeline has one shipper. It's 10,000 barrel a day commitment. I believe based on the fact that Delek owns half of the pipeline via a JV from when it got built, that Delek is actually the counterparty on that pipeline. So even though it's just a 10,000 barrel a day minimum commitment, Delek is moving quite a few barrels a day through this pipeline. But everything seems to be moving at the actual committed rate. So I don't think that Calumet's moving uncommitted barrels through this pipeline. The more likely scenario, I think, is they're having Delek market for them, and they're taking the barrels from Delek at this point, because all the barrels shipped through this pipeline appear to me to be committed barrels at the committed rates. So I think Calumet's buying their barrels off of Delek at this brown point here, and maybe seeing a little bit of a change for that now that Permian Express is delivering in here a little bit. So I think that's a good summary of where Calumet's getting their barrels from Longview. This isn't really that big of a production area, but Longview has access to barrels from the Permian via Permian Express, via West Texas Gulf. They have access to Cushing barrels via Red River that we'll talk about in a minute here. So they can get diversified supply from the Longview area. So that's a good overview of Calumet's Shreveport refinery. Let's take a look at Delek El Dorado, and this is the big one here. So as you can see, they run this one pretty close to capacity, or when the last year or two that I looked, it was pretty close to capacity. So again, let's work our way backwards on this one. So we have the El Dorado refinery here. Delek Logistics owns the pipeline that moves kind of the barrels to the last mile here. And that connects into Magnolia, and we talked about Magnolia briefly. Magnolia is getting the barrels from the Shreveport area, and let's look at the flows on Magnolia, and you guys can see what they're actually flowing here. So remember, El Dorado is about 80,000 barrels a day. They are getting a little bit of local production, and they're also getting, let's call it 30 to 35,000. Let's call it 35,000 barrels a day off of Magnolia. So where's Magnolia getting its supply from? If we click on the transaction point here, we can see most of their supplies coming from Caddo. Not a surprise, given we've already shown that Delek owns half of Caddo pipeline. It would stand to reason that they would use their own pipeline to ship themselves barrels. So quite a few barrels, that 30 to 35,000 barrels a day coming in at that point. They also pull a little bit of local production here, I believe. So let's put Caddo on the map. Again, we're tracing our way back. So Caddo connects back to Longview. I mentioned already that Delek owns 50% of Caddo, that they're what I believe to be the only shipper on Caddo. Until recently, there was a new contract that got added in 2015, a new commitment. I'm not sure who that is, but Delek does have what I believe to be the anchor and the initial contract on this pipeline. Only 10,000 barrels a day of commitment. Now, where does these barrels come from? Now, I noted when we were talking about Calumet Shreveport that they can come from Cushing, they can come from the Permian, across on the Permian. Delek actually did a deal with Plains in 2019 to get into a JV on this Red River pipeline coming down from Cushing. So this pipeline was built in 2016. Plains did a deal to do an undivided joint interest on this northern section going down to this Hewitt point here with Valero. So Valero uses a portion of this capacity via their own undivided joint interest to feed their Ardmore refinery. Plains owned the rest of the capacity that wasn't being used by Valero. And then Plains did an expansion on this pipeline in 2019. And as part of that expansion, Delek bought 33% of this pipeline and took their commitment from 35,000 barrels a day to 100,000 barrels a day on this pipeline. So kind of in exchange for, hey, help us build this expansion and we'll give you part of the JV. That's kind of how it appears that was structured there. So I'll click on the flow point here and you can see the flows. You can see when the expansion came online. You can certainly see the tick up in flows when that expansion came online and that commitment came up to ship more for Delek. So Delek is moving barrels from Cushing here down into the Longview area. And again, this was a 100,000 barrel a day commitment. They've recently restructured that contract to extend the term of the contract and then lower the barrels to 80,000. So the current commitment's 80,000. But again, to reiterate, Delek is moving the barrels down Red River into Longview. From Longview, it's going on Caddo. From Caddo, it's going up Magnolia. And then from Magnolia, it's going to El Dorado. Now, we talked earlier, and you guys can see there's lots of flows on this pipeline. Not all of these are making their way all the way to El Dorado. So Delek is probably not all these flows either. Again, their commitment was only 100,000 barrels a day. It's now stepped down to 80,000 barrels a day. There's other shippers on this pipeline. And Delek is leaving some barrels in Longview, which eventually go over to the refinery in Tyler. They have the option to ship some barrels south, but only some of the barrels are making their way over to El Dorado. And again, we'll click on Magnolia's flow point, and the capacity of El Dorado is 80,000. We only see about 35,000 barrels a day of it coming down this route. So where do the other barrels come from? They come from Mid-Valley's pipeline. So I told you guys that the Plains kind of dominates this section. Well, this is the section. This is like the little piece that they don't dominate, and it's what comes across from Longview here. So Mid-Valley Pipeline's an energy transfer pipeline, and it moves substantial volumes from Longview, dumps a little bit in Louisiana, and then takes a bunch of barrels up to the Midwest to hit up Ohio refineries and delivery points up there. What's actually moving on this pipeline? Let's zoom in so I can make sure I hit the actual flow point instead of the actual receipt point. So back in time, 200 to 250,000 barrels a day flowing down Mid-Valley. Now it's 150 to 200-ish flowing on this pipeline. And again, a lot of that's going up into the Midwest to feed those refineries, but some is being left here. So what's interesting about this piece, remember we have about 35 to 40,000 barrels a day that need to find their way into El Dorado to fill its capacity. What's interesting here is if you look at actually mid-value in the state data, it shows them not shipping that much up this line. It actually falls off to zero in 2023. So when I was trying to understand these markets, I was a bit stuck. You only have 35,000 barrels a day going up Magnolia. You don't have enough local production to fill El Dorado. So where's El Dorado getting most of the rest of its oil from? The 35 to 40,000 barrels that I can't see that are making its way into the refinery. It's not Mid-Valley, but it is Mid-Valley. So Mid-Valley in the state data actually dumps some off to Sunoco and Energy Transfer's marketing arm, and I believe that happens here. And I'll switch this over. I believe this is a lease that Energy Transfer marketing arm has on Mid-Valley, and that's what's shipping the actual barrels according to the data. So these are the barrels that are coming up, and I'll bring back Mid-Valley so you can kind of see the whole connection here. This is a lease component, and those barrels are coming up Mid-Valley and then connecting into El Dorado and then going across. So this is interesting to me because it's kind of a niche area. It's kind of an area that I didn't know a lot about, and it's kind of dominated by Plains and Energy Transfer with maybe a little bit of competition brewing there. into the future. We'll see what happens with Permian Express potentially taking some market share at Calumet. We'll see how that plays out. I do think the El Dorado flows on Caddo and Red River are safe, given that Delek owns portions of those pipelines. So I think Plains has this corridor pretty well locked up, with certainly some area, certainly some barrels at the Calumet Shreveport refinery that could be competed for between Plains and Energy Transfer, between their two pipelines. So we'll see. We'll see what that looks like into the future. Yeah, so that's hopefully I haven't gone too long. Hopefully this was instructive. I know this isn't the most exciting area, but if you want to understand all of Louisiana, this is an area that's important to understand. Thanks for listening. We'll be out with part 3 soon, and have a great day.